Our furniture says a lot about us. It tells us a bit of our history, both in style and sometimes in circumstance. Take for instance this desk. I made this desk several years ago. My style was a little bit different back there and it reflects that, but also I didn't have the shop setup that I have now, and the techniques that I had were limited to the tools and space that I had to build it. This chair that I'm sitting on, for instance, too, is not an office chair. It's one that I took from the dining room just next to it, because I built a new office and decided to put the office chair inside there. But even more telling is this piece of furniture here underneath our printer. We didn't have something for our printer stand, and so the circumstances dictated that we used what we had on hand. I think that's common with furniture. This is just a box full of books. In today's video, I wanted to build a new stand for our printer, but I was struggling to think of what kind of style I was going to use for it. Did I want something with a commercial look, or maybe something like you would buy from a box store, or maybe something fancier and a mission style or something classical? But then, as I was thinking about it, a voice came to me and gave me the idea of what to do.
A weighted companion cube.
A weighted companion cube. At first I questioned that voice, but it came again.
A weighted companion cube.
Yes, I think that's it. We're going to do a weighted companion cube. Now, not all of you may know exactly what that is, but stick around, watch this video, and watch as I build a weighted companion cube printer stand, life size.
Please note that we have added a consequence for failure, unsatisfactory mark on your official testing record, followed by death. Good luck.
Wait, what? For those of you who are still a little confused about what it is that I'm building, let me explain what the weighted companion cube is. The weighted companion cube is one of the all-time video game classic characters from the game Portal, which came out in 2007. It's also an inanimate box. The cube also shows up in the sequel to the game Portal 2. Now I'm going to be creating it in the visual style of the original in Portal, but I'm going to be doing it at the slightly smaller size in Portal 2. My first consideration in building the cube is what material to use. The panels here lend themselves to using a sheet good instead of hardwood. There are also a lot of beveled edges, and it's hard to get a smooth beveled edge out of plywood. So ultimately I decided on MDF, despite it not being one of my favorite materials to work with. The build starts by ripping 45-degree miters on all four sides of some 2x2 panels. Fun fact, there are 6 sides to a cube, and so I'm making 6 of these panels. And another fun fact is that MDF is very heavy. I marked the center of each of these 6 panels so that I can take this circle jig that I'm putting on here and cut out a circle to remove some of that weight from the MDF. This circle cutting jig is something I designed myself. I did all of the math and then let the laser cutter cut it out. And if you're interested in it, it's something I do offer in my Etsy store, which I link in my videos below. The circle that I'm cutting here is 1 inch shorter in its diameter than the circle that will go raised above this panel. Since these circles are smaller than the ones that will be on the final outside, I had to try and think of something I might do with all of that material. I'll show you the result of that at the end of the video. I set the panels aside and I started to work on the corner pieces. And here you're watching me make my very first mistake. When making this cut, I added 1 inch to the dimensions of the corner because I knew I was going to cut a 45-degree miter. Unfortunately, I had forgotten that these corners are actually 2-ply of material, so I should have given myself a little more than 1.5 inches instead of a little more than 3/4 of an inch. That's not going to be a problem for these midsections, which are just 1-ply of material. Now as I cut the middle pieces to size and glue up the panels for the corner pieces, I try and console myself over my mistake by letting a little ditty play in my head. Something like this.
But there's no sense crying over every mistake. You just keep on trying till you run out of cake. And the science gets done and you make a neat gun for the people who are still alive.
Each side of the corner pieces is going to have its own bevel, but before I can do any of that I have to straighten out the glue piece. Once I've done that, I can start with the first edge and I rip a 45-degree angle down the length. Each one of these laminated strips gives me 5 pieces to make up my corners, and each corner takes 3 pieces, and there are 8 corners total on a cube, so I need 24 of them. But I made 25 just in case I make a mistake along the way. I cut them to length first on the miter saw because that made them easier to work with. But then I immediately took them over and did the second 45-degree miter on the table saw using the exact same setting I had done for the long strip. The 45-degree miters are for connecting the pieces together, but the visible miters are going to be in the opposite slope, and they're going to be 30 degrees. So I set the table saw to that 30-degree mark, and then I began cutting first the mid pieces. Once I'm done with the 16 mid pieces cutting the short side, I can turn my attention back to the corner pieces. The 2 straight sides there now need a 30-degree bevel in the opposite slope from the miters. The corner and the mid pieces both have sections on them where a radius is cut out of them, and that radius cut also has to have that 30-degree bevel. In order to do that, I need to make a template to help me on the router table. I drew the shapes out using Inkscape, which is a free vector graphics program. Then I sent those over to my laser cutter, where I'm going to make those cuts out of a clear acrylic plastic. I'm leaving 2 little holes in each of them so that I can attach them to the piece. Once I attach the template to the mid piece using some screws, I can just run it through the router table up against a 30-degree chamfer bit. I wanted to do the same thing with the corner pieces, but the chamfer bit is only 1 inch tall, and I couldn't find one that was any bigger without needing to have a shaper instead of a router table. So instead, I drew out the corner, cut it out on a bandsaw, then took it over to a spindle sander and set the table to that 30-degree mark, and just hogged out the material with the sander. I did this 25 times. Even with dust collection going, there was a lot of fine sawdust all around my shop. The MDF sheet that I used to cut the 6 panels out of had just enough room to cut 6 circles. These are the circles that are going to add the weight back from the circles that I'd cut earlier. However, I'm only going to use 5 of those circles. I want this to actually resemble a cabinet in the end, and I want one of these circles to operate as a door. I didn't really trust screwing a hinge into the MDF. I thought it could rip out pretty easily. So what I'm doing here is I'm gluing up a panel of maple, and I'm going to make one of the round circles out of this maple, and it will operate as my cabinet door. The circle cutting jig works just as well on this hardwood as it did on the MDF. You just have to move a little bit slower and maybe do an extra pass. Once all 6 round pieces were cut out, including the door, I took each one over and rounded it over on one end to match the look from the game. MDF can be sanded like any other wood. The difference is that you skip some of the earlier grits. If you were going to start, say, at a 60 or 80 grit, maybe you'd start with a 120 or 150 when working on MDF. It's still important to do, though, before you start the finishing process. Like most woodworking videos, you're seeing about 1% of the sanding that I do, probably less than that. MDF is super porous, and so you can't just start with paint. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking some Kills, which is a spray primer, and I'm putting it on all of the surfaces. I'm going to do this on all the MDF surfaces that I'm going to paint. On these round pieces, I did the door side on the back and the front. The others I just did the front. From here on out, I'm going to be going between finishing and assembly quite a bit to allow for some drying times. These corners are assembled from their 3 pieces. First by using some painter's tape on the outside of the miter joints, and then just gluing the insides. Once I fold them into place, I can add some more blue tape to the last joint. The panels aren't quite done at this point either. There are these little lines that are indented and have kind of a pink or magenta glow that come out 4 sides from the inner circle. I made a little jig to help me in cutting these out, and I had actually marked halfway down each side of the panel and marked the middle of that jig and lined those 2 marks up before I do any of this cutting. I repeated this on all 6 of the panel sides. The corner and mid pieces are going to be attached with screws, so I'm pre-drilling the holes that they're going to be screwed through. I'm not actively measuring each one of these, I just know that I'm well within the boundaries of the pieces and what is going to cover up on that panel. I didn't get any video of this, but I also added 4 more screws right around the circle, where the larger circles are going to be attached with screws as well. I did this on 5 of the panels. The last panel is the one that's going to have the door and won't have that same attachment. As I wait for the primer to dry on the panels, I go back to assembly and gluing. And these are the mid pieces. They're made up of 2 pieces, but the technique is still the same as the corners. In the game, the weighted companion cube has a little bit of a beat up look, and I'm going to try and achieve this by using different layers of paint. I'm going to start with the white that is the primer, then I'm going to do this light gray, and then once I've assembled it, I'm going to come back with a little bit of a darker gray. The round parts on each panel have a cute little pink heart on them. In order to create this, I'm going to create stencils using cutouts from the laser. I had first made a pass on the stand to make some markings that would help me line up where that circle would go as a laser cut is done. I'm then just using a slight score on the tape that I put on the top of the round, which I can peel off, and that will give me a stencil from which to paint the pink onto the white. When using spray paint like this and a stencil, it's important to cover the sides so that that pink isn't going to be visible on anything other than the heart. While that paint dries, I need to add yet another bevel to my corners and my mid pieces to better match the look from the game. I do this up against the fence, and then where all 3 points meet in the middle, I just kind of eyeball a 45-degree angle there. The mid pieces have that same look, so I'm applying the same technique to them. Now I know this kind of looks like Kirby before you put your glasses on, but watch how it comes out as you take the tape from the stencil off. Perfectly formed heart shape. The corners and mid pieces also need some paint, a slightly lighter gray than that of the panels. And here I'm actually using a chalk spray paint for the first time, and I quite like it, goes on really smooth. I was masking off the panels to do a little more painting when something kind of weird happened. I swear this wasn't happening before I put the tape on there. I decided to try another experiment. Crazy, huh? I feel like you could do something with this. Well, before I was tempted to go rob some banks, I decided to get back to work, and I went in to mask off and spray this pink inside on these panels. I actually kind of didn't like the way that came out, so I ended up only doing 2 of the panels, and I've got another idea which I'll do in a little bit for coloring those in. But now it's time to assemble the box in full, all 6 sides put together. I'm gluing and stapling it together. The staple is going where the corners and mid pieces are going to go, so you're not going to see them in the end. Putting on that 3rd layer and the 3rd different color on the main panels here, and I'm deliberately not covering the paint entirely to give it more of that industrial kind of worn look. That look will contrast with these corners that I'm now adding onto it, which have that smoother gray feel to it. And believe it or not, these corners are about as heavy as the entire box was. Adding them doubles the weight. Now I get to use about all of the acrobatic skill I have left in my aging body here to screw in these screws through the holes that I had drilled earlier. First I'm doing the 3 sides for each one of the corner pieces, and then I'm going to move around and try and get the middle pieces doing 2 sides each. Unfortunately, it was at this point that I realized my second big mistake. It turns out that there are not 8 middle pieces like I'm assembling here now, there are 12 of them. And so I get to do it again, going back through all of the scrap MDF I had left over and trying to find enough pieces that I can make 4 more of those middle sections. Most of the time when I redo things like this, I end up coming up with an improved process. But this mistake was just simply a counting mistake, and I was fine with the process I had used, so I'm building these pretty much exactly the same way as I had before. I did get a little bit smarter in my assembly method. I cut out a little tiny block that I used to do the spacing when I placed them in there, and then I used a clamp to hold them in place while I screwed them in. The last step of the build is to install the door, and I'm drilling some holes for the hinges right now. But what I'd really like you to look at is those lines, those pink purple lines that are in there. Those are the ones where I didn't like the paint job. And so what I actually did was laser cut out some plastic pieces, and I used some CA glue to put those in place. I'm using my hinge boring jig here to put a 35mm hole into the door, which will fit a hinge that provides a 1/2 inch overlap. I'm then using some very long screws to attach this hinge because I'm drilling into MDF, which isn't the strongest material for this sort of thing. With the door attached, the weighted companion cube is done. Well, here it is. The weighted companion cube is all done, and it's now my printer stand. And if I'm really being honest, this is something that I have wanted to build for years. I just simply didn't have the tools and the means to do it. It does beg the question, though, that I asked at the very beginning of the video. If our furniture says something about us, what does this say about me? I think for one, it says that I've always loved video games and that they're a big part of my life. In fact, I've made them a big part of my career as well. It also says that I just love building things. And I think that this particular build came out just the way I wanted it to, and it was an awful lot of fun to do, which is a great combination. Now, I think there was one more thing. I was going to share with you the portal cake as well. Well, I've put it inside, and I'd love you to come on over and take a look at it.
No, she's like, guys, I want to play too.